Excited about this session because I think change management is very, very important. And I know you all agree with that. And it's very, very difficult. Maybe impossible, I don't know. Also, I'm super excited to have Dr. Richard here. I think everybody has heard of him and has read his work. I've referenced his work a lot. Sally referenced his work in yesterday's keynote. So he's live in person. And Julia Montgomery is fantastic. I'm sure you all know her too. So I'm going to let you guys take it away. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. Really excited to be here with you guys today. This is my first KM&I conference, and I know many of you from speaking at ILTA, where I'm a regular speaker on the topic of change management, and specifically change management for lawyers. I've been in the legal industry for more than 20 years, and a certified change management practitioner for 15, I think. And I'm really excited about the conversation we're going to have today, because when I first became a change management practitioner, and I was bright-eyed and bushy-tailed and got really excited about going out into the law firms and helping them make change happen, one of the things that I learned really quickly was all the best practices that I learned when I got certified in change management didn't work on lawyers. And so I thought, wow, I'm doing this wrong, right? And I kept thinking I was getting it wrong. I didn't know what I was doing. But it turns out that I had the great good fortune to come upon the work of Dr. Larry Richard, who, as he'll tell you in a moment, has spent many years studying psychological traits of lawyers and has some really amazing data and insights. And his work transformed mine. Once I understood the keys that Dr. Richard's work kind of gave me, I was able to modify the change management playbook that is the standard, and I understood why many of the best practices that they teach us when they certify us in change management don't work on lawyers. And so I had to modify my strategies, modify my playbooks to be successful in getting lawyers on board with change. And so when Patrick reached out and asked if I was interested in coming to talk to you guys about change management, I knew many of you have seen me speak at ILTA, and I wanted to bring something different to the table. And I had this wild notion that what if I just called Larry and said, hey, you want to come and talk about this with me? Because it's like a fangirl moment for me, I have to be honest. And I was thrilled that he agreed. So without further ado, I would like to ask Larry to introduce himself to those of you who might not know him already and tell you a little bit about the work that he's been doing for a long time in this area.
Great. Thank you, Julia. Good morning, everybody. So I started out as a lawyer at age 2. It sounds like a joke, but if you knew my family, you'd see it's actually the truth. I had 14 lawyers growing up in my extended family. In fact, one of my family members who was not a lawyer, my aunt, we're sitting at Thanksgiving dinner, and Evie, her father was a lawyer, husband, son, and daughter, and we're kind of suspicious about the family dog. So she turns to the table and gets this astonished look on her face, and the room gets quiet, and she says, oh my God, it's just dawned on me, I'm the only one in my entire family who never says in any event. So this, scarring early helps you figure out your career choice. So I practiced law as a litigator for 10 years, found that it wasn't a good fit for me. It was causing a lot of stress. And my first love always was and had been psychology. I just went into law because it was kind of the family business. So I did a reset, and I went and earned a PhD in psychology, and I studied lawyers. My doctoral research was looking at thousands of lawyers across the US and their personality traits. And at the same time I was focusing on personality, I was also focused on change management. That was actually the core curriculum of my graduate program. So I had these two areas of organizational and individual, and they both become passions of mine over the years. I've gathered in the last 30 years personality data on over 42,000 lawyers. And the story that it tells is pretty much the same. Lawyers are dramatically different from other people, and they're very similar to each other in some quite striking ways. The traits that make people good lawyers also make it really hard for them to do a lot of other things usually in roles that require relationship building, trust building. So intellectual things we're really good at, but the things that that skill of being a good lawyer disrupts and actually makes us more vulnerable to some real problems, which is not really our topic for today, but it's something that is in the air because of the wellness issues that everybody's talking about. So with that, let's get started.
Let's do it. So one of the tools that you use in your work is the caliper profile. Oh, wait, can we do one thing before we start? Usually, when I'm talking about this topic, I like to poll the room and find out how many lawyers are in the room before I tell you terrible things about yourself.
So raise your hand if you went to law school, even if you didn't practice law. Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Raise your hand if you didn't go to law school, but you feel like based on the experience you've had, by all rights, damn it, you should be considered a lawyer. All right. How many will never want that label no matter what ever happens? I think we've covered the entire audience.
Okay, so back to the nuts and bolts. One of the tools that you use in your work is the caliper profile, which I believe assesses folks on 20 traits. Is it 21 traits?
Yeah.
And this was the tool that helped you sort of do trend analysis and identify where you had outliers. And as I recall from our conversation, when I look at my notes, an outlier score is the average score for a non-lawyer. I like to say
So basically, caliper measures traits on a percentile scale, which is the common way to do it with industrial strength assessment tools. So scale goes from 0% to 100%. Anybody on any one of the traits could score anywhere on that spectrum, but there tends, like most other data that are interval data like this, most data form a bell curve, where the majority of people will score on a trait in the middle, and fewer people will score low or high on the scale. And if you take any occupation and you aggregate their scores, the lows and highs cancel out, and you get an average that's somewhere in the middle, between 40 and 60%. And you would expect any occupation, knowledge management professionals, bus drivers, accountants, you'd expect any occupation to have an average for each of the 21 traits between 40 and 60. And then that would be true. If you look at any occupation, every single trait, 21 traits in a row, between 40 and 60, asterisk. There's one occupation that does not fit that pattern. And it has not one, not two, but 7 of the 21 traits that are below 40 or above 60. And yes, we're talking about lawyers. And I'm actually investigating, I don't know if I mentioned this to you, I'm investigating an 8th trait that now, it wasn't ever reported before, but Caliper started adding it about 2 years ago. And I now have about 300 lawyer scores on this one trait, and all but 2 of them are below the 50% mark. Now, 300 is not enough to make me say it's an outlier, but by next year this time, I should be able to say whether it is. It seems like it's the 8th outlier trait.
And what is that trait?
That trait is called dogmatism. Basically, lawyers are very opinionated and positioned.
I can save you some trouble on the rest of those profiles if you want.
I mean, most lawyers I present this to, they say, no, I'm not.
So the 7 outliers we have up on a slide here, I'm really visual, and I like to kind of, see things as I talk about them. And I will tell you that when I think about change management work, all of these really can present high resistance roadblocks for you and your change initiatives. I heard someone yesterday from the stage talk about one of the core best practices in change management is you have to communicate something at least 7 times. Does anybody remember hearing that yesterday? So let's talk, we're going to focus on 3 of the traits, but one that I just want to kind of use as an example and how this impacted my work was that is true for the average person, but the average lawyer has an urgency score of 71. So 7 times communicating something to the average person who has an urgency score of 50 and might take the time to read your communications works. But when a lawyer has an urgency score of 71, then you're going to need to up your number. That best practice of communicate it 7 times and they hear it doesn't land, you have to ramp up your communication because the urgency score means they're not reading your email, they might not even open it, they skimmed it at best. You also have to reformat the way you communicate. I'm a big above the fold person, or above the scroll line, as I like to call it, and you have to have an executive summary at the top. So I started learning how these traits overlaid on top of change management best practices required a different strategy and a different playbook. So there are 3 traits that we're going to focus on today because they have the most significant impact on your change work. And the 3 that we're going to talk about are skepticism, because you kind of have to, like it's a 90 out of 100. And then resilience, which can be the most delicate, I find, to talk about because it's pretty far below the waterline there. And then last but not least, autonomy, almost as high as skepticism. And each one of these has a significant impact on your ability to successfully implement change or get buy-in and adoption from lawyers to your change initiatives. So let's start with talking about how most people implement change. You talked about the 3 kind of typical approaches.
Yeah. So first I want to make one edit. For those who are counting, I said 7 traits and you only see 6 on the chart. That's because the data that we're showing you come from an article that describes some research that I did early on. And in recent years, there's a 7th trait, empathy, that never was an outlier, but it was very close. And in the last 5 to 10 years, it's been dropping steadily. And it's dropping the world over, not just in lawyers, but in everybody under 40. In other words, millennials have lower empathy. One study said that millennials have 40% less empathy than the previous generation, to which millennials said, yeah, whatever. So what Julie is referring to is the idea that when people try to influence lawyers, and there's any organization that has lawyers in them, and by the way, if you're not a lawyer, whatever your professional training is, if you work with lawyers, around lawyers, for lawyers, you're going to start acting like a lawyer. Lawyer traits tend to cascade to other people around them. So everything we're talking about here is not just about lawyers. It's about anyone who works in a legal environment. When you try to influence lawyers, you try to get them to do stuff that they're not doing, or you try to get them to stop doing stuff that they are doing. The most common approaches that we try, number 1 is using logic, or what I call persuasion. It's just kind of the standard go-to thing. And for lawyers especially, wouldn't you think that would work great? It doesn't, for 3 reasons we'll talk about. Number 2 is the carrot, and number 3 is the stick. So the carrot is basically incentivizing, and the stick is coercion. And all 3 of these very common, widely used strategies not only fail when you try them with lawyers, but they actually are worse. They backfire because the lawyer is what psychologists call, they have reactance, which means, oh yeah? And I dig my heels in, and now I'm even more committed to my prior position than I was before you made the attempt to persuade me. So using these 3 very widespread strategies is going to lose you ground in the effort of persuading.
So I think of the 3, I most often see folks trying to leverage persuasion, right? I just make a rational argument and they'll get it, the light bulb will go off. I'm doing this to help them so they'll understand that and they'll buy in, but it rarely works that way. Rarely. So let's talk a little bit about the high skepticism trait and why persuasion causes, as you say, a reaction.
So lawyers, as you can see from the chart, the average skepticism is 90% compared to 50 for the public. This means that lawyers are basically walking around going, oh yeah? Now, if you try to persuade somebody, what we're trained in law school to do is, quote, think like a lawyer, which means think skeptically. Challenge every assertion that somebody makes. Look for the problems. Look for what could go wrong. Challenge somebody's motives. What are you really after? And so anything that you say to a lawyer attempting to persuade them triggers that adversarial training, that advocacy gene. Lawyers have persuasion radar, and as soon as you try to persuade them, the law school training kicks in. And even if it's a reasonable request, instead of agreeing with you, you say, it's a beautiful day out. And they're instinctive knee-jerk response is, well, yeah, but it could rain. So that alone is probably enough to sink the ship. But wait, there's more. Number two, what do you want to do next?
Resilience.
So resilience.
My favorite.
So what is resilience? Resilience, we normally think of, I want to make a distinction between what I call big R resilience and little r resilience. Big R resilience is kind of the resilience we usually hear about in the newspapers, magazines, online, stories about people who suffered some adversity. You know, they went through a flood, a fire, tornado, COVID, car accident.
Deploying a CRM.
Exactly. And they manage somehow to dig deep and recover from that trauma and even to do better as a result of that effort to recover. That's resilience in the vernacular, the big R resilience. There's also a first cousin, works in a similar way, but it's a personality trait, and it's mainly about interpersonal setbacks. When you are criticized, when you're rejected, when somebody excludes you from a meeting you should be in, when you make a mistake and you're worried about the blowback, when you are under stress of any sort, that is evoking this little r, low resilience. So a high resilience person, when they're criticized, tends to be more bulletproof. You criticize them and they go, yeah, whatever. And if they do let it get under their skin, they bounce back quickly. But a low resilience person is thin-skinned, easily hurt, easily wounded, defensive, starts always explaining and defending themselves, feel insecure. And even when it's not a criticism, a low resilience person distorts their reality. So the example I give is, let's pretend that Julia was a low resilience person and we're walking down the main street of Washington and we go past a beautiful clothing boutique and I say, Julia, look at that outfit in the window. You'd look great in that outfit.
Is this about my pants?
And if she were a high resilience person, she'd say thank you because it was a compliment. But a low resilience person says, what are you saying? You don't like what I'm wearing? So we just pull that criticism out of the compliment. Now, because that distortion field is always on, it's always kind of scanning for what can I distort to see it as a criticism of me. If I ask you to do something, the brain of a low resilience lawyer says, wait a minute, you're telling me I should do something I'm not now doing? Are you saying I'm doing it wrong currently? And they get defensive and they don't want to hear it. And what's the natural response? I'm not going to do that. It gets their back up. So we don't even need the first thing about skepticism and the adversarial mindset. The low resilience is enough to sink the ship. But wait, there's more.
Well, I want to pause and talk a little bit about one facet of resilience that came up in our conversations. And that was, we talked about, I like to nerd out on brain science with you, Larry, it's fun. We talked about the amygdala, yep. And we talked about, I noted in Eric's keynote, he talked about the decline in attention span, yep. That in the target or the prediction is that our attention span will be 7 seconds, whereas a goldfish has an attention span of 8. And that's really sobering, I think. There's a lot of good work out there. Jonathan Haidt writes about the great rewiring of our brains with digital inputs, social media. But we talked about the beauty of analog watches, right? I never went on board with the Apple Watch because I kept seeing my friends in this Pavlovian sort of constant disconnecting, right? Not being present. And you talked about how this constant stream of inputs and stimulus are sort of creating a fear layer in our brain. And so when you're already prone to low resilience and you have this sort of heightened state of fear or alertness, that incoming change can feel even more threatening than it would just sitting at a score of 30.
Right. So basically, at a neuroscience level, low resilience is a very simple mechanism. The amygdala, which is sensing threat, starts pumping out these nasty chemicals, cortisol and others that Eric talked about. And you can mitigate that. You can even prevent the release of those nasty chemicals by your thought patterns, which is the intellectual part of your brain, or the prefrontal cortex. And the prefrontal cortex, or what I call the part of the brain that went to law school, it's in communication. There are neural pathways between the PFC and the two amygdala on either side of our brain. If the PFC has got a rapid pathway, if the neurons travel quickly down that pathway, they can intercept the threat message and produce some sort of calming, reassuring cognitive message. Don't worry, that's not a snake, it's only a shadow, that type of thing. If the pathway is slow, the amygdala will release the cortisol into the system before the PFC gets to calm it. So basically, high resilience is having a fast pathway so that your PFC can dampen the amygdala before it does its damage. And what we're seeing now is with all of the distractibility, it's doing two things. It's slowing down the messaging between the PFC and the amygdala, and it's ramping up the threat signal of the amygdala in the first place, which makes it really, really hard to be resilient. But it doesn't have to be that way. We can train people to mitigate on both ends of that equation.
So let's talk about the practical strategies. Before we jump into that, we had one more trait we wanted to touch on that's can be a real challenge, and that is autonomy.
Yeah, as in don't tell me what to do. So the average autonomy score for the public is 50. The average for lawyers is 89%. Don't you dare tell me what to do. So if you have this high level of autonomy, basically means everything that you see and hear in your environment will be distorted and coded as efforts to influence or tell me what to do. I was once in a continuing legal ed conference, and I flipped my pen out of my hand. It landed on the seat of the person next to me, and I said, "Could you hand me my pen, please?" And he said, "Well, it's your pen, get it yourself." And I said, "Yeah, but it's under your seat." He said, "Yeah, but it's your pen." I mean, this went on for like a few minutes, and I realized it's not about the pen. The pen has suddenly taken on this symbolism of control. Whoever picks up the pen has now ceded control to the other person. And I was stuck in this loop because obviously me and the other guy were both extraordinarily high in autonomy, and neither of us was going to crawl on our hands and knees and get the bleeping pen. I finally conceded because it was my pen, so I crawled under his chair and I got the pen.
He told that story later, and in the version he told, he won. Yeah.
So the point is that autonomy makes us resist any effort to tell us what to do, even if it's a good thing. And again, you hardly need the first two principles, because this one alone could sink the ship. High autonomy makes it unlikely that a persuasion effort is going to succeed.
So far, we've provided everyone with really good reasons why a lot of the smart things we do don't work. Persuasion sinks the ship, as you say. So let's talk about what we should be doing instead. Some strategies or techniques or tactics that can work to help overcome these challenges.
So the principle that we're working on here is anything direct is going to cause that reactance that I mentioned. Any of these efforts that I described, they're all direct efforts. I'm going to try to persuade you using one of these three techniques. And by the way, when you try to persuade using incentivizing, it also feels like pressure. Even though it's an incentive and it's theoretically a good thing, if you do this, I'll give you X. I wasn't doing X before, I wasn't doing this thing before, and now you come along and you say, please do this and I'll give you a reward, and my brain is like, oh man, do I have to do this? How can I say no? They're going to give me a free iPad? Oh man. And so it feels like pressure and we resist it. And coercion, it's obvious. If you try to coerce somebody, you're going to trigger that autonomy reaction. So what do? The answer is indirect influence techniques. And there's a body of research in social psychology started by one of my heroes, Robert Cialdini, who was a psychologist for many years at Arizona State University. And he investigated why people comply with requests that they really normally wouldn't want to comply with. It started because when he was a young professor, his neighbor had kids, and one of the kids would come to his doorstep every year and try to sell him Girl Scout cookies, and he always ended up buying them. And he said, I know two things about myself. I like money, and I don't like cookies. And at the end of the transaction, I'd have her cookies, and she'd have my money. And I kept wondering, how did this keep happening? And so he started studying compliance, and he found that there were 6 very, very repeatable, observable patterns of influence that are all indirect, that seem to trigger most people, not everybody, but seem to trigger most people into complying. And we don't have time to cover all 6 of these. There's now a 7th one in his most recent book added. But we're going to cover the 4 most potent for the legal profession, which are antidotes to the problems that we've outlined.
First, I think up is scarcity.
Okay, so scarcity, I'm sorry, we don't actually have enough time to cover this one. That's okay with you guys, isn't it? Right? So we don't have enough time. We don't have enough information. We don't have enough product. Advertisers and savvy marketing companies use this principle all the time. When we detect that something is in short supply, our brain immediately convinces us that it's more desirable than it was when it was abundant. Anything that is scarce, we suddenly want. That's why we buy stuff we didn't really want, because there was only 2 of them left. So if you can use scarcity, you can get lawyers to do stuff. Let's say, for example, I want lawyers to attend a meeting. One of the things I'm going to suggest to my client is have the meeting, set up the meeting so it's done in smaller groups, and put a limit, a head count limit on each meeting. We're only going to admit 12 people to this meeting. First come, first served. Instead of saying, please attend this meeting, and we'll try to twist arms and get you to attend, which sets up the reactance, you say, I don't know if you're going to make it into this meeting. It's only 12 places, and there's a lot more of you, so let's see who gets into the meeting. That kind of scarcity reaction tends to be really effective. It really mobilizes lawyers.
Next, I want to talk about my favorite that I've had a lot of good success with, and that's reciprocity.
Yeah, reciprocity. So reciprocity is basically a universal principle. Anthropologists have studied this in over 32 countries, and in every single one, there are 3 obligations that society tends to enact. Again, not everybody follows them, but every society has these 3 obligations. It is seen as a positive in every society to give to others. There's no society on the planet that's been studied where not giving is a norm. So giving is a norm. Number 2, every society has an obligation to receive. It's considered bad form if somebody says, Julia, I have a gift for you, and Julia says, I don't want it. I don't like your gift. That's always considered a snub in every culture. And the third, and the most important for our purposes, is in every society there is an obligation to reciprocate when you've been given something. So if I give you a gift, you are going to feel like you owe me something. And what's interesting is the reciprocal obligation can actually be quite large and disproportionate to the original gift. It's not an equal playing field. In fact, we even use the phrase, if you've ever watched the old Western movies, somebody does something nice for somebody and the other person says, well, much obliged. Much obliged. I feel an obligation to reciprocate. So if you give something genuinely, earnestly to somebody without strings attached, I'm going to do a nice thing for you. And then you don't accept payback, you wait until you get it on your terms. If you later ask that person for a favor, they're just going to be much more inclined to reciprocate to you because you did something unsolicited for them. Now, don't confuse this with contingent requests. Contingent request reverses the sequence. A contingent request says, hey, if you do this, in return, I'll do this nice thing for you. It's easy to reject a contingent request. It won't work. But if I go out on a limb, and a simple thing, could be I go out and I get myself a cup of coffee and I bring an extra one back for Julia. She didn't ask me. I say, hey, I was getting coffee. I thought you might want one. She may not even drink coffee, but she feels obligated to now, later on in the day, when we were talking about, well, let's go to lunch. Where do you want to go? How about Chinese? Oh, I don't really like Chinese. Oh, but I'd really love to go there. Well, okay, I guess I'll go Chinese. because she feels obligated because of the free coffee. And the Chinese meal is a lot more expensive than a cup of coffee. So that's reciprocity.
I love that one. I'm mindful of time, and I want to make sure folks have time to ask us some questions because I imagine they do. But there are two others that we haven't talked about, social proof and consistency and commitment.
So let's talk social proof. Social proof works really well in law firms and most other places. Social proof basically says when we want to know the right behavior to do, especially in situations where it's unclear, ambiguous, a little fuzzy, which in a world of constant change is kind of every time these days, we look to see what other people like us are doing. So if you've ever been out on the street in Midtown and somebody just starts looking up at a tall building, within minutes, 25 people are now looking up at the building. I don't know why, we're all just looking up, we all do it, right? That's this principle of social proof. We all do what other people are doing. Nobody wants to be the first to do it. It's kind of like the famous Kansas railroad train crossing law. No train, at a crossroads, no train shall go until the other has gone. So this idea of social proof, if you can marshal enough evidence that this is how other people are doing it, you don't even have to say, and you should too. You just let everybody know this is what the trend is. And this happens, by the way, with wash day products, the #1 selling wash day product. More people are visiting our website than ever before. And companies like to use this social proof idea, and you can use it in your efforts to influence lawyers in a subtle way. You don't have to finish the persuasion. And then the last one, what was the last one?
Commitment and consistency.
Consistency. So this is called the foot in the door technique. If I do a little thing, or I get you to do a little thing, human beings like to be consistent. So if I behave in a certain way, in a small, inconsequential way, later, when you ask me to do that same thing in a more consequential way, I feel like I have to do it because I'm already the kind of person who does that sort of thing. So I'll give you a simple example. There was a study done in California where they asked people to put a humongous, ugly 30-foot hand-lettered sign on their lawn that said, "Keep California beautiful." Nobody in their right mind would say yes to this, but it's California, and 17% said, "Sure, put that billboard on my lawn." And then they took another group, and before they asked the same exact question, a week earlier, they went to these homes, and they said, "Would you put this index card, 3x5 card, in your big picture window?" These are 4-acre minimum homes. And they said, and it said, "Keep California beautiful." And everybody said, "Sure, I'll put that index card in my window." A week later, they went back and showed them the 30-foot ugly billboard. "Would you put this on your lawn?" Instead of 17%, they had 76% said yes. Just because a week before, that same message was in their picture window that nobody saw, it influenced them overwhelmingly to agree to the request.
Thank you, Larry. I want to invite folks to ask questions. I will say that if you follow me on LinkedIn or find me on LinkedIn, I'm going to share a few books. I'll post a link to Cialdini's book that we referenced, also the work of Jonathan Haidt, who's talking about the rewiring of our brains in the digital age, and of course, the old Standby Switch by Chip and Dan Heath, which incorporates work from both of those.
Jonah Berger from Wharton School.
Of course.
He also has some excellent books. Catalyst is the one I'd recommend that has some more of these research-based persuasion tools.
We'll also share some strategies, practical strategies. For example, when we talk about social proof, what would that look like in action for you? So we'll post that on LinkedIn for you. So with that, do we have any questions from the room? Hand in the back from Ted.
I have two questions. The first one should be simple to answer, and that is how much of these traits are nature versus nurture? In other words, are people with these qualities, do they tend to gravitate towards the legal field, or does their experience in the legal field trend to cultivate these tendencies or traits?
Yep.
And then secondarily, when I look at the traits, they don't seem well aligned for leadership. Maybe aside from abstract reasoning, and that the law firm leadership tends to get elevated because they're the best at lawyering, and I would think those traits would be more pronounced. Is there any impact there?
That's right. So first, to the question of nature versus nurture, every personality trait is some of each. We used to think it was 50-50, but there's beautiful research from identical twins separated at birth. And that twins research suggested it's more like 75-25 in favor of hereditary. So traits are mostly genetically predisposed with a small learning component. And that means that traits are pretty stable and tenacious. You can't change them. There's a rubber band effect. When you try to change them, it bounces back. The exception is 3 of the 7 outlier traits are more learned than genetic. That's quite surprising because most traits are more genetic, and the few traits that are not happen to be among the 7 outliers. Skepticism is more learned. We're born trusting. We learn to be skeptical. Empathy is very learned and easy to improve without the rubber band effect. And resilience is the most learnable. There's a small set point about our resilience, but most of it's learned. The second part of that question is, do lawyers come to the table with that, or do they learn it in law school? Certainly law school increases skepticism because it's a learned trait. We see first-year law students are about 10% more skeptical. By the time they graduate, they're about 20% more skeptical. Part of that is that low skeptics drop out of law school at a higher rate. And part of it is that we're constantly hearing skeptical messaging. And by the time I test them, which is by partners, 10 to 13 years out of law school, they're 90% skeptical. So there's a learning curve for that trait. Resilience happens to be pushed down the more skeptical thinking you do. So the more skeptical you are over time, the more your resilience drops. So that's also changeable over time. Empathy, same thing. The other traits are pretty much drawn to the profession as it is. If you go to a first-year law student cohort, you're going to see higher levels of autonomy. People who like autonomy gravitate to the professions in general. You're going to see higher levels of abstract reasoning. That's the #1 reason people go to law school. You're going to see lower levels of sociability. People who are social geeks in college, they don't like to go out on Saturday night. They study instead. They go to law school. And what am I leaving out? Urgency. So urgency, it's the weakest of the 4, but you still see elevated urgency going to law school. And then the final question, leadership. Leadership is not about personality per se. It's about doing certain behaviors. The research shows that if you do these behaviors, people will follow you as a leader. Personality enters the picture in respect of how hard or easy, how comfortable or uncomfortable it is to do these leadership behaviors. And you're right, the traits that make somebody a good lawyer make it an uphill climb to do the effective leader behavior. So for example, one of the most important leadership behaviors, leadership is a response to change and uncertainty. It's the only time we need leadership. So leaders by definition take risks. Lawyers are risk averse. And so to be a good leader, you have to take risks, and you're fighting your natural tendency. So you have to be trained to let go of that and step into your discomfort zone, as Eric wisely said. And it's like that with a lot of the other traits.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, I hate having you.